Heinrich Himmler, the second most powerful man in the Third Reich, spent his final day not in a bunker, but in a British interrogation room. He had just been captured, disguised as a low-ranking policeman. This man, who controlled the Gestapo, the SS, and the entire concentration camp system, was now utterly alone. The British officers searching him had no idea he held a secret that would end his life in minutes. The story of his horrible final 24 hours reveals the complete collapse of the Nazi regime from the inside. To understand the fall, one must first grasp the scale of the empire Himmler commanded. By 1944, his authority was not merely military, it was an administrative empire constructed from files, decrees, and bureaucratic precision. This control extended far beyond the SS, encompassing the entire German police apparatus, the concentration camp system, and vast economic enterprises that fueled the war machine. The structure was intricate and all-encompassing. The Waffen-SS fought as elite combat divisions on the front lines, while the Gestapo and the Sicherheitsdienst, or SD, secured the homeland and occupied territories through surveillance and terror. Simultaneously, the Inspectorate of Concentration Camps under Oswald Pohl managed an industrial-scale network of forced labor and extermination. This network included major camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau, which combined a labor camp with a dedicated killing center. Himmler's desk in Berlin was the nexus of this entire system. On it, orders authorizing mass murder were signed alongside mundane administrative paperwork concerning budgets, personnel, and supplies. The same pen that approved a shipment of Zyklon B might later initial a memo about office furniture. This was not a chaotic reign of terror, but a highly organized state within a state, answerable only to Hitler. The sheer volume of Himmler's responsibilities was staggering. He directed racial policy, oversaw arms production in SS-run factories, managed settlement plans in the East, and controlled the intelligence apparatus that spanned Europe. This bureaucratic omnipotence made him seemingly indispensable to the functioning of the Nazi regime. He was the chief administrator of atrocity. Yet this very bureaucracy, the source of his immense power, would become the primary instrument of his isolation. The system relied on a strict chain of command, detailed record-keeping, and the absolute authority vested in his titles. When those titles were revoked, the machine would instantly cease to recognize him. He had built an apparatus so vast, so dependent on his signature, that its collapse would be total and would leave no place for its architect. The empire of paper was formidable, but it was also fragile. Its strength was entirely conditional on the legitimacy granted by the regime it served. The first visible break came as overtures. As the Eastern Front crumbled in early 1945, the foundations of Heinrich Himmler's absolute loyalty began to fracture. The relentless advance of the Red Army made the outcome of the war undeniable. In this atmosphere of impending doom, Himmler initiated a series of clandestine contacts with neutral parties. His most significant channel was Count Folke Bernadotte, the deputy chief of the Swedish Red Cross. But a key precursor came on April 21, 1945, when Himmler received Norbert Massur, a representative of the World Jewish Congress at Hohenlychen. The goal of these communications was starkly pragmatic: to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies that would explicitly exclude the Soviet Union. This initiative represented a profound betrayal of Hitler's doctrine of total war. For years, Himmler had been the regime's most loyal enforcer, the guardian of its ideological purity. Now, he was attempting to circumvent the Führer entirely. His motivations were a complex mixture of survival instinct and political ambition. He believed he could salvage something from the wreckage, perhaps his own life, a measure of power, or even a leadership role in a post-Hitler Germany. He saw the war's end not only as a catastrophe, but as an opportunity. The first of the Bernadotte meetings took place on April 22, 1945. at Hohenlohen, the private nursing home north of Berlin where Himmler was then residing. A second, more extended meeting followed on April the 23rd and 24th in Lübeck. In these discussions, Himmler positioned himself as a pragmatic leader who could control the situation. As a gesture of goodwill, he authorized the release of prisoners through the White Buses operation, which evacuated approximately 20,000 inmates, many of them Scandinavian, from camps in the north. This was a calculated move, designed to demonstrate his authority and his capacity for humanitarian action. Yet these diplomatic maneuvers were hesitant and contradictory. They revealed a man trapped between two immovable forces. On one side was a fanatical Führer who would never countenance surrender. On the other were the Western Allies, publicly and privately committed to unconditional surrender. From the start, Himmler's position as a potential negotiator was untenable. He was the architect of the Holocaust, a central planner of genocide. To Allied leaders, he was not a partner in peace, but a principal defendant in the trials they already anticipated. Himmler was playing a game for which he held no viable cards. His ambition to succeed Hitler only heightened the futility of his efforts. He misread the political reality, believing his administrative control could translate into negotiating leverage on the world stage. This miscalculation had immediate consequences. News of his treachery moved quickly through diplomatic and media channels, and it would not remain hidden from the bunker for long. What followed would strip away the titles that defined him and turn his own machine against him. News of Himmler's treachery reached Hitler in the Berlin bunker on April the 28th, 1945. The source was a Reuters report broadcast by the BBC detailing Himmler's secret negotiations with the Western Allies. This public revelation of a private betrayal triggered an immediate and severe reaction from the Führer. In the claustrophobic confines of the bunker, surrounded by the final collapse of his regime, Hitler's rage was apocalyptic. He declared Himmler a traitor. In a series of furious orders, Hitler stripped Himmler of every one of his official positions. This included his core identities: Reichsführer SS, Chief of the German Police, and Minister of the Interior. He was also dismissed from his military command of Army Group Vistula. For a man whose entire existence was synonymous with these titles, this was a symbolic execution. The formal order of dismissal was delivered to Himmler in writing, a bureaucratic severance that nullified his authority with the stroke of a pen. Himmler was now an outlaw within the very regime he had helped design and build. The administrative machine he had controlled for years was instantly turned against him. The vast network of the SS, the Gestapo, and the police apparatus no longer answered to him. In fact, they were now mandated to arrest him. He was no longer the second most powerful man in Germany. He was a fugitive with a price on his head, hunted by the system he had created. This moment severed his last official tie to the collapsing Reich. The architect was now homeless, cast out from the structure he had spent over a decade constructing. The power vacuum his removal created contributed directly to the final disintegration of Nazi authority. The SS, without its leader, began to fragment. Some units continued to fight with fanatical determination. Others simply dissolved or sought to surrender. Himmler's response to his dismissal was a desperate attempt to escape the consequences. He fled to Flensburg in northern Germany, where the remnants of the Dönitz government were operating. There, he undertook a physical transformation that underscored his complete fall from power. He shaved his distinctive mustache, donned an eye patch, and exchanged his black SS uniform for the field gray garb of a military police sergeant. This was a stark contrast to the man who had commanded absolute obedience. He was now attempting to vanish into the chaos of a defeated nation, a solitary figure trying to outrun the shadow of his own empire. The machinery of state had expelled its chief engineer. Cast adrift by his formal dismissal, Heinrich Himmler joined the immense flood of refugees and defeated soldiers fleeing north. His immediate task was to disappear completely. He assembled a small, trusted group of aides, including his personal administrative officer, Dr. Rudolf Brandt, his chief surgeon, Professor Karl Gebhardt, and his personal aide, Josef Kiermaier. This carefully selected entourage was tasked with protecting him and navigating the treacherous landscape of Allied-controlled territory. He discarded the iconic black SS uniform that had defined his public identity for over a decade. In its place, he put on the field gray uniform of a Feldgendarmerie sergeant. He adopted the name Heinrich Himmler, supported by a set of forged papers. These documents identified him as an ex-sergeant of a special armored company attached to the secret field police who had been officially demobilized on May 3, 1945. This cover story was a calculated risk, as members of the secret field police were also subject to automatic arrest, but it was designed to help him blend in with the masses of discharged soldiers. The physical transformation was meticulous. He shaved off his distinctive toothbrush mustache, a feature central to his public image. He wore an eye patch over his left eye and carried simple soldier's gear. The man who had demanded absolute obedience now sought to become invisible, blending into the anonymous ranks of a broken nation. This was more than a superficial change of clothes. It represented a profound psychological unraveling. The Reichsführer SS was gone. In his place was Sergeant Himmler. He was now entirely dependent on the very systems of movement and deception he had created to control others. For years, his apparatus had manufactured false identities, controlled travel permits, and tracked populations. Now, he relied on a single set of forged papers to grant him passage. The irony was stark. For the first time since his rise to power, he was not in command. He was a passenger in his own escape, his safety entrusted to the loyalty of his aides and the quality of their forgeries. The group moved cautiously, avoiding major checkpoints where their documents might receive closer scrutiny. They traveled through the countryside of northern Germany, a landscape choked with the human debris of a collapsed empire. Every interaction with a British patrol or a checkpoint was a test of their disguise. The forged documents, while convincing at a glance, contained flaws that a trained eye could detect. The stamps and seals, though skillfully replicated, were not perfect. Their own meticulous forgery would ultimately become the instrument of their capture. The British soldiers were under orders to arrest all members of the SS and SD, including non-commissioned officers. The Himmler identity, which placed its holder within the orbit of the Sicherheitsdienst, made him a primary target, not a plausible civilian. The disguise designed to conceal him instead painted a target on his back. Himmler's escape plan contained a critical flaw that had nothing to do with his own disguise. The weakness was his companions. While fiercely loyal, his aides were high-ranking SS officers accustomed to command, not deception. Dr. Rudolf Brandt, his personal administrative officer, and Professor Karl Gebhardt, his chief surgeon, were men of significant status. Their attempts to act like low-level functionaries were unconvincing. Their behavior, their precise speech, and their very bearing betrayed their true identities. They moved with an authority that did not match their humble cover stories. The forged documents they carried were another point of failure. While the papers for Heinrich Himmler and the others were convincing at a casual glance, they could not withstand expert scrutiny. The stamps and seals, though skillfully replicated, were not perfect facsimiles of official issue. A trained eye would notice discrepancies in the ink, the pressure of the stamp, or the typography. Furthermore, the cover story itself was risky. Himmler's alias identified him as a member of the Secret Field Police, an organization whose members were also subject to automatic arrest by the Allies. The disguise intended to conceal him instead placed him squarely within a category of personnel the British were actively hunting. The group moved cautiously through the countryside of northern Germany, deliberately avoiding major checkpoints where their documents might receive closer examination. They traveled in a small convoy, sticking to secondary roads, but the net was closing. British military intelligence units were conducting systematic sweeps of the region, specifically searching for high-value Nazi targets. They had lists of names and descriptions. The chaos of the surrender provided cover, but it also made any group of men trying to avoid attention inherently suspicious. The very professionalism of the British Army, which Himmler had spent years studying as a formidable enemy, now became his greatest personal threat. Their procedures for processing the millions of surrendering German personnel were methodical and thorough. They were trained to look for inconsistencies, to question stories, and to inspect identification with a skeptical eye. For all his planning, Himmler's fate now hinged on the observational skills of a junior officer at a random checkpoint. The success of his entire escape relied on a single, fleeting interaction with a soldier who had no idea of the prize that stood before him. The system he had evaded for days was about to engage. On the morning of May 21st, 1945, the small group was stopped at a British checkpoint near Bremervörde. The checkpoint was manned by soldiers of the 51st Highland Division, positioned near a bridge to control the flow of refugees and surrendering troops. Their task was screening, with specific orders for the automatic arrest of any SS members or war criminals. The location was a mill that served as a temporary office, staffed by vigilant soldiers who had seen combat just weeks before. The initial inspection of the three men was routine. They presented their demobilization papers, standard documents issued to German soldiers after the surrender. But the behavior of the group immediately aroused suspicion. The man identifying himself as Sergeant Heinrich Himmler appeared small and skinny, wearing a distinctive black eye patch. His two companions seemed overly concerned about him, their attention and demeanor inconsistent with soldiers who had been officially discharged. This discrepancy between their humble cover story and their evident anxiety marked them for closer scrutiny. The British troops were particularly alert to forged documents, a common tactic for SS members trying to evade capture. Upon examining the papers presented by the man claiming to be Himmler, they noticed a familiar stamp. It was the same stamp they had seen on other forged identity cards. This discovery transformed a routine check into a potential intelligence capture. The soldiers decided the men warranted further investigation at a more secure facility. They were not treated as high-value targets yet, but as suspicious characters requiring standard processing. The group was separated and transported to a screening center at Lüneburg. This transfer marked the first real peeling back of the disguise. Himmler was now entirely within the British military system, a cog in their procedural machine. He received no special attention. He was just one more detainee among thousands. The immense power he had wielded over life and death for years offered him no protection. His fate was now subject to the methodical, impersonal efficiency of a victorious army's bureaucracy. He was at the mercy of a standard military procedure designed to filter the chaotic mass of surrendering personnel. The system was not looking for him specifically at that moment, but it was calibrated to identify anomalies. The very qualities that made his aides loyal, their high rank and protective nature, had made them conspicuous. The forged documents, intended to be their ticket to freedom, became the evidence that triggered their detention. The checkpoint at Bremervörde was not a dramatic confrontation, but a logical outcome of a process Himmler himself could no longer control. The machinery he had evaded for days had finally engaged, and it operated with a cold, dispassionate logic. At Lüneburg, routine processing gave way to a formal interrogation. The three detainees were delivered to civil internment camp number 031, where Captain Thomas Sylvester, the senior intelligence officer, oversaw screening. Himmler had been moved through holding points after the checkpoint and now entered a tighter system. The Bremervörde suspicion was no longer a note on a file. It was a case. The men were separated and questioned individually. Their stories were compared line by line. The quiet figure with the eye patch drew the most attention. His companions struggled to inhabit their covers. Their diction, posture, and controlled deference spoke of rank rather than recent demobilization. The man calling himself Heinrich Himmler remained composed and clipped in his answers, but the papers he carried did not withstand a second review. Under close inspection, the forgeries showed their seams. Stamps looked familiar because they matched known counterfeit patterns. Paper texture and typefaces deviated from genuine issue. The details failed under the microscope of practiced eyes. Captain Sylvester escalated to a direct test. He ordered the prisoner to remove his eye patch and spectacles. The face that emerged, sharp bones, receding hairline, cold stare, aligned with photographs known to every British officer in that room. The shaved mustache and soiled field grey could not erase the underlying likeness. Confirmation came from two directions at once. The interrogators produced a photograph of Heinrich Himmler in SS uniform and watched the man's reaction. At the same time, word spread within the camp that a suspect matched the Reichsführer SS. Ex-Gauleiter Karl Kaufmann, already interned there, was brought in and recognized Himmler when the eye patch was off. That recognition, from a former Nazi provincial leader, reinforced the identification for the British. Confronted with the evidence, the prisoner's reserve slipped. He acknowledged the truth with a flat statement. "I am Heinrich Himmler." The alias collapsed. The file changed. He became a designated high-value detainee. Procedures shifted accordingly. Routine screening ended. Guards tightened the perimeter, and custody moved under stricter regulations. The priority was secure containment and prevention of self-harm or escape. Every movement was recorded. Every object within reach was reconsidered as a potential risk. The room's atmosphere hardened. The officers present understood the significance of the name and the potential consequences of a lapse. The machinery was now focused on a single task: hold the prisoner safely and lawfully while the next steps were initiated. With identity established, the next step followed the standing rules for such captures. A medical officer was called, and preparations began for a full examination and change of clothing under controlled conditions. The medical examination began only after transfer to the British billet at 31, a Wilsener Strasse in Lüneburg, a requisitioned house now under tight guard. With identity established, procedure shifted from intake to containment. A senior medical officer was requested to carry out the formal check required for high-value detainees and to prepare him for issue clothing. Captain C.J. Wells, a military doctor with the Second Army, arrived to conduct the exam. His mandate was clear: assess the prisoner's condition and ensure he carried no hidden instruments of suicide. Earlier searches had already turned up one cyanide capsule concealed in a small brass container in Himmler's clothing, an alarming find that confirmed the risk. That discovery sharpened the caution with which the final examination proceeded. Himmler presented as controlled and responsive. He complied with orders, undressed under supervision, and allowed the inspection to proceed step by step. Wells and the guards checked seams, linings, and any likely caches. They moved through a methodical sequence, aware that senior Nazis often carried poison and that concealment could be ingenious. The search then narrowed to the head and mouth. Wells required the prisoner to open wide, remove his dental plate, and submit to a careful oral inspection. Light and angle mattered. As Wells leaned in, he observed something he described as a dark object in a gap in the lower jaw. It was not a routine discoloration. It sat where a fragment could be wedged and held out of casual view. Wells reacted immediately. He tried to dislodge the object with a finger and a tool. In that instant, the prisoner jerked, clamped down, and bit. Glass cracked. The taste and smell that followed told the story: potassium cyanide. The speed of action left little room for intervention. The room moved at once. Guards seized Himmler, forced his mouth open, and attempted to clear it. An emetic and countermeasures were readied in vain. Cyanide overwhelms in seconds. Respiration faltered. Pulses slowed. Medical efforts continued because procedure required them, but the outcome was already written in chemistry. Wells recorded what he had seen and done. The sequence of movements, the position of the object, the timing of collapse. The documentation would matter. It showed an examination conducted according to standing orders and a suicide effected in the last possible gap. What followed inside the house would be formalized in reports and statements. Outside that room, officers prepared to resume questioning, unaware that events had overtaken their plans. Back in the interrogation setting, the atmosphere had already shifted from intake to substance. The British intended to press for names, structures, and crimes, and they brought him in accordingly. The final interrogation, as officers conceived it, never truly began. Identification had shifted the process to containment and transfer, and Himmler was moved under guard to a requisitioned house in Lüneburg, 31 Uelzener Straße, described by the British as a house for special purposes. There, with tighter security and formal procedures, preparations were made that would precede any substantive questioning. British priorities were clear: secure the prisoner, remove opportunities for self-harm, and document his condition. Colonel Michael Murphy coordinated with Captain Thomas Sylvester to manage custody and next steps, but protocol required a comprehensive medical examination before issue clothing and further interrogation. That duty fell to Captain C.J. Wells of the Second Army, summoned to conduct the final detailed inspection. Himmler entered the room controlled and compliant. He undressed under supervision and submitted to a systematic search. Earlier, a cyanide capsule had been found in a brass container sewn into his clothing, proof of intent and a warning to proceed with care. Wells and the guards worked methodically, aware that senior Nazis often concealed additional poison. The examination narrowed to the head and mouth. Wells ordered the removal of spectacles and the dental plate, then used light and close observation to check the oral cavity. In the lower jaw, he saw an object dark against the gum line, nestled where it could be held out of easy view. He moved to dislodge it. What followed was seconds. Himmler jerked, clenched his teeth, and bit. The sound was a sharp crack of glass. Air in the room took on the bitter almond smell associated with potassium cyanide. Wells reacted at once, and guards closed in, but chemistry outran intent. Cyanide disrupts cellular respiration by blocking cytochrome C oxidase. The body's cells cannot use oxygen. Collapse comes fast. Attempts at immediate countermeasures began even as the signal of poisoning was unmistakable. Hands forced at the jaw. Efforts to clear the mouth. Orders shouted down the corridor for equipment. But the interval between the bite and systemic failure was measured in breaths. Convulsions started. Skin tone shifted. Breathing fought and then faltered. The officers present understood the significance of the name and the magnitude of the loss to justice, yet procedure drove each action. Record the sequence, persist with aid, secure the scene. Wells noted the time and the circumstances, establishing a record of a suicide carried out during a lawful medical inspection. In that room, the intention to interrogate gave way to a crisis of seconds. The smell lingered. Movements narrowed to the body on the floor and the hands, trying to reverse the irreversible. The next moments would be defined by reaction rather than inquiry. The British officers reacted immediately to the sound of the crunching glass, but they were too late. The poison was already in his system. They wrestled the convulsing Himmler to the ground, a tangle of limbs on the floor of the interrogation room. Their immediate goal was to force his mouth open, to clear any remaining fragments of the capsule and the toxic contents. It was a desperate, physical struggle against the chemical process already underway. Someone shouted for an emetic, a substance to induce vomiting. The hope was to make him expel the poison before it could be fully absorbed. Another officer attempted to clear his airway with a finger, a dangerous act that risked their own exposure to the cyanide residue. Their efforts were frantic, driven by the imperative to save a prisoner whose testimony was considered vital. A stomach pump was called for, but the poison acts with terrifying speed. Cyanide, specifically potassium cyanide, inhibits cytochrome CE oxidase, an enzyme essential for cellular respiration. It effectively suffocates the body from the inside, preventing cells from using oxygen. Himmler's body was racked with violent convulsions as his nervous system began to shut down. The lack of oxygen at a cellular level causes rapid systemic failure. His skin would have taken on a bluish tint, a condition known as cyanosis. The distinctive smell of bitter almonds, a hallmark of cyanide poisoning, permeated the room. This odor is produced when the cyanide compound reacts with moisture in the air. Within minutes, the convulsions ceased. Heinrich Himmler was dead. The time was officially recorded as 23:14 on May 23, 1945. The man who had overseen the systematic deaths of millions had chosen a quick clinical end for himself. His death was not a prolonged suffering, but a swift termination. He had successfully cheated the public spectacle of the Nuremberg trials and the hangman's noose that undoubtedly awaited him. The empty chair reserved for him at the subsequent trials would become a powerful symbol of his escape from judicial accountability. The final authority he exercised was over his own life. This act was the ultimate expression of the control he had sought throughout his career. In the end, his power was reduced to a single, selfish decision. The British soldiers were left with a corpse, the scent of almonds hanging in the air, and the grim reality of the situation. Their intelligence coup had ended in a fatal failure of security. The chaos in the room subsided, replaced by a stunned silence. The frantic attempts to save him gave way to the procedural necessities that follow a death in custody. The immediate priority shifted from interrogation to containment of the scene and documentation of the event. The body of one of history's most wanted men now lay on the floor, a problem to be processed. The officers who had grappled with him now had to confront the fact that their high-value captive had irrevocably slipped away, denying the world a full accounting of his actions and the system he commanded. The clinical nature of his suicide stood in stark contrast to the industrial brutality he had administered to so many others. The British authorities moved swiftly to confirm the identity of the body and document the cause of death. A detailed autopsy was performed by Captain R.H.L. Rumbelow, an experienced pathologist. The procedure confirmed death by cyanide poisoning. The official report noted the presence of a small blue glass capsule fragment lodged between Himmler's teeth and the characteristic smell of bitter almonds. The cause of death was recorded as suicide. Parts of the body were removed for further examination. A section of the brain was excised and sent to a specialist for analysis. The purpose was to search for any physiological abnormalities that might offer a medical explanation for his actions. The results of this examination were later lost, adding a layer of mystery to the final disposition of his remains. A death mask was also made, a plaster cast preserving the exact features of the most wanted man in Europe for historical and identification purposes. The body was then prepared for burial, but the British faced a significant dilemma. They did not want his grave to become a shrine for Nazi sympathizers. A public burial was out of the question. The decision was made to dispose of the body with absolute secrecy. The goal was to erase his physical presence from the landscape, to deny his followers any focal point for veneration. Under cover of darkness on May 24, 1945, Himmler's body was wrapped in camouflage netting and driven to a secluded location on Lüneburg Heath. The exact spot was chosen at random by the small burial detail. The party consisted of 2 intelligence officers and several soldiers. They used army shovels to dig a grave in the soft, sandy soil of the heath. The site was unmarked and deliberately chosen for its anonymity. The burial was conducted with military efficiency. There was no ceremony, no word spoken over the body. He was interred in the simple British Army uniform he had been wearing at the time of his death. The grave was filled in, and the ground was carefully restored to its natural state. The soldiers scuffed the earth with their boots to eliminate any signs of recent digging. The exact location was known only to the few men present, and they were instructed to keep it secret. The physical remains of Heinrich Himmler were effectively erased from the landscape. The British military command considered the matter closed. They had confirmed his death, documented the cause, and disposed of the body in a manner that prevented any future political complications. This act of bureaucratic finality was the last chapter in the administration of his case. The man who had built an empire was reduced to a secret buried in an unmarked plot of earth. His grave as anonymous as the millions of victims he had created. The secrecy of the burial, while practical, would later become the foundation for persistent rumors and conspiracy theories regarding his fate. The lack of a public grave fueled speculation for decades, but the historical record is clear. His journey ended not with a public reckoning, but with a clandestine interment on a lonely heath. In that environment, doubt took on a life of its own. The seeds of conspiracy sprouted from a sparse public record and a sudden, unseen end. The secrecy surrounding the burial of Heinrich Himmler, combined with the removal of body parts during the autopsy, created fertile ground for speculation. Almost immediately after the official announcement of his death, rumors circulated that he had escaped. The absence of a public grave or any photographic evidence of his corpse fed these doubts. In the chaotic aftermath of the war, with countless Nazis vanishing into new identities, the idea that the Reichsführer SS had slipped away seemed plausible to some. One persistent claim suggested that a double had been captured and killed in his place. Advocates pointed to the brief time between identification and death and argued that British officers had been deceived by a look-alike. Others focused on the missing parts of the body, particularly sections of the brain and elements of the skeleton removed during the autopsy and later lost to the archival record. When the body was exhumed for a second examination in 1946, most of the teeth were reported missing, complicating dental comparison and adding another point of suspicion for those already inclined to disbelieve the official account. These points, secrecy, missing remains, and a sparse visual record, became the core engine of conspiracy. Later recollections, such as contradictions in statements attributed to Werner Grossmann, Himmler's adjutant, added noise rather than clarity. Memory under stress fractures. Timelines blur. Conspiracy literature treated those inconsistencies as proof, weaving them into elaborate tales of escape to South America or survival under an alias in Europe. Historians have addressed these claims directly. The eyewitness accounts from the British officers present at Lüneburg are consistent and credible. The documentary trail, from initial detention to identification to transfer to the medical examination and death, survives in military files. The chain of custody for the body through autopsy and burial is traceable through orders, reports, and diaries. Where gaps exist, they reflect the disorder of the moment rather than intention. The lack of photographs was policy to prevent propaganda and martyrdom, not a sign of substitution. The persistence of the myths says less about the evidence and more about psychology. It is difficult to reconcile the image of a bureaucratic architect of terror with a squalid, self-inflicted end. Conspiracy theories restore to Himmler a control he no longer possessed. They imagine a final master stroke to match the systems he built. The truth is simpler and more damning. There was no grand escape, no brilliant deception. A routine process identified him, a medical inspection found his last weapon, and he used it to avoid the reckoning that waited. What followed his death would unfold not in secret, but in the open, where the vacuum left by his absence exposed the fragility of the structure he had commanded. Himmler's death on May 23, 1945, created an immediate and profound power vacuum in the final days of the collapsing Third Reich. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, whom Hitler had named his successor in his political testament, now led what was essentially a phantom government from Flensburg near the Danish border. This administration exercised no real authority beyond a shrinking perimeter, its primary function being to negotiate the surrender of German forces to the Allies. The chain of command Hitler had meticulously built was broken. The SS, the very instrument of Himmler's power, now faced its own dissolution without its leader. The organization fragmented. Some Waffen-SS units, particularly those on the Eastern Front, continued to fight with fanatical determination, fearing Soviet vengeance. Others simply dissolved, their members discarding their uniforms and attempting to blend into the civilian population. Many surrendered en masse to Western Allied forces, hoping for more lenient treatment. The central command structure that had coordinated the SS's actions across Europe ceased to exist. The machinery of terror Himmler had overseen ground to an abrupt halt. With the chain of command broken and Allied armies advancing, the concentration camp system was liberated. The process was not instantaneous, but occurred over the preceding and subsequent weeks, as Allied units stumbled upon the camps. The administrative apparatus that managed the camps, the transfers, the orders, the meticulous record-keeping, fell silent. The empire of paper was rendered obsolete by military defeat. At the Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945, the empty chair where Heinrich Himmler should have sat became a powerful and haunting symbol. His principal subordinates, men like Hermann Göring, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, and Albert Speer, were left to answer for a system he had designed and commanded. The prosecution presented vast evidence of his central role, but the man himself was absent. The trial could not interrogate his motivations or demand his personal accountability. His suicide denied the world a full judicial accounting of his actions and his ideology. It left historians to piece together his role and psychology from the immense paper trail he left behind. The memos, the speeches, the orders. This documentary record is extensive, but it lacks the confrontation that a trial would have provided. Historians are left to interpret his intentions from memoranda signed in cold, bureaucratic language. The empire he built outlasted him by only days. The Dönitz government was dissolved and its members arrested by the Allies on May 23rd, the very day of Himmler's death. The shadow of that empire, however, would linger for generations. The evidence of its crimes, uncovered at Nuremberg and in the years that followed, shaped international law and the modern understanding of genocide. The bureaucratic efficiency of its atrocities became a permanent lesson in the potential for modern states to enact evil. His final 24 hours were a microcosm of the regime's total collapse. The journey from commanding a state within a state to being a fugitive in a sergeant's uniform and finally to a corpse on an interrogation room floor illustrated the complete inversion of power. The chaos of his capture and death mirrored the chaos engulfing Germany. It was a collapse engineered not just by military defeat, but by the internal failure of a system built on terror and absolute loyalty, which proved brittle when its leader turned fugitive. The authority he had wielded evaporated, leaving him isolated and ultimately reduced to a single, desperate act. Heinrich Himmler's story represents one of history's most stark inversions of power. His trajectory was not a gradual decline, but a precipitous fall from a position of near absolute authority to utter powerlessness. This arc was completed not over years, but within the span of a single day. The man who commanded an empire of terror spent his final hours as a prisoner, subjected to the very bureaucratic procedures he had mastered. He rose to power through a meticulous understanding of bureaucracy. His authority was not based on charisma, but on files, hierarchies, and a fanatical ideology. He built a state within a state, an administrative machine that managed everything from the Gestapo and the concentration camps to vast industrial enterprises. His power was rooted in paperwork and the precise delegation of terror. He commanded loyalty through a system of titles and ranks that he controlled completely. Yet the system he built contained the seeds of its own destruction. Its strength was entirely dependent on the legitimacy granted by the Nazi regime. When that regime collapsed, the structure lost its foundation. The bureaucracy that had been the source of his power became the instrument of his isolation. The titles that defined him were revoked with a single order from Hitler. The machine he designed could no longer recognize its architect. His final day was a systematic unraveling of that power. It was a process of reduction. Stripped of his titles, he became a man without an office. Disguised as a common sergeant, he shed the identity that had granted him authority. Subjected to standard military procedure at a British checkpoint, he was reduced to his most basic element, a suspicious character requiring processing. The system he had evaded finally engaged him, and it operated with a cold, dispassionate logic that acknowledged none of his former status. The cyanide capsule was his last resort. It was the final bureaucratic solution to an inescapable problem. In the world he inhabited, poison was a tool of espionage and a means of controlled exit. Its use was clinical and efficient. He did not choose a soldier's death or a dramatic stand. He chose a method that reflected the cold, administrative nature of his rule. It was an act of termination. His death was not a grand, dramatic event. It was a sordid, clinical end in a dusty interrogation room. There was no battle, no final speech. There was the crunch of glass, the smell of bitter almonds, and a frantic struggle on the floor. The convulsions of his body were a stark contrast to the image of the controlled, omnipotent leader. The scene was one of chaos and desperation, not dignity or defiance. The arc from omnipotence to isolation was completed in less than 24 hours. It began with his formal dismissal by Hitler and ended with his burial in an unmarked grave. This collapse was engineered not primarily by his enemies, but by the inevitable failure of the monstrous system he created. The regime's internal logic, its demand for total loyalty, and its inability to accept defeat turned on him. His fate was a direct consequence of the pathological administrative state he had helped to build and lead. The inversion was total. The architect was destroyed by his own design. Heinrich Himmler's final 24 hours offer a unique lens on the end of the Third Reich. It was not merely a military defeat, but the implosion of a pathological administrative state. His journey from absolute power to a fugitive's death illustrates the fragility of a system built on terror and bureaucracy. His suicide robbed the world of a definitive reckoning, leaving historians to reconstruct his role from the vast paper trail he left behind. This period serves as a microcosm of the regime's collapse, revealing the desperation and ultimate failure of its architects. If this story moved you, challenged you, or helped you see the Second World War differently, it would be an honor to have you join our growing community. Subscribing isn't just a click. It's a way to support more powerful stories, more forgotten voices, and more truth from the past. So if you believe these stories matter, hit that subscribe button and let's keep building this journey together. And don't forget to leave a comment. We read everyone and love hearing your thoughts. Until next time, keep exploring history. Keep asking questions. Keep seeking the truth.